going to discuss, as my title says, I'm going to discuss responsibility in terms of truth and the presentation of truth, or the responsibility for posting truth on social media. But actually, my interest is going to, my focus is going to be broader than social media itself, because as is going to become apparent as we go through the talk, there's a very complex ecosystem of information sharing on the internet that goes beyond social media, and that has a very extreme effect on what is shared on social media, but also on what people are exposed to in terms of content. So, as Marika said, it's a topical issue to address because of the prevalence, or the apparent prevalence, of all kinds of strange theories that are currently doing the rounds, and that do seem to be entering the mainstream to a greater extent than they had in the past, or it is perhaps just more obvious to us how mainstream strange ideas and beliefs are, although research does seem to suggest that what would traditionally have been relegated to kind of fringe groups outside of the mainstream, and the kinds of ideas that would have been popular there, or at least prevalent there, do seem to be entering the mainstream. And one of the main sources for this is social media, but then not only social media, but kind of the entire web ecosystem where we obtain our information. And basically, the interest, or my interest in terms of this talk, is, well, who do we hold responsible? If it is the case that more and more outlandish theories and more outlandish beliefs are entering the mainstream, and if it is the case that these are being more, or it's becoming more difficult to counter these kinds of beliefs, who do we blame? Not necessarily in a moral manner. We could assign moral blame, but I'm more interested currently in epistemic blame. So I'll discuss the difference between kind of moral blame or moral responsibility and epistemic responsibility in a moment. So my contents are going to follow the following kind of roadmap, if you will. I'm just going to talk a little bit about news, the consuming of news via social media. So who gets their information via social media, and what are the apparent effects? But I'm just going to quote some statistics. I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. I'm just going to give you some philosophical groundwork just to orientate you with regard to some of the terminology, especially with regard to virtuous epistemology, which I'll discuss. And then I'll briefly discuss Miller's claim. So Miller is a philosopher who, as I indicated in my abstract, recently argued that, in fact, people who gain outlandish beliefs, as he called it, via social media are not to blame if we take current virtue epistemological standards or norms into account. So they're not to blame for their outlandish beliefs, and we'll discuss why he says that. And then I'm going to go on to argue that Miller actually underestimates the problem and underestimates how little blame we can accord to social media users and other internet users for their outlandish beliefs, given the structure of the internet and given the structure of the resources that we have available to gain knowledge. So I'm also going to broaden the focus not only on news content, but any kind of facts that we would want to access via the internet. All right, so I'll discuss that and how that relates to personalized advertising and the main internet platforms that peddle personalized advertising, which is basically all of the big ones. And then I'll discuss the implications of that. Okay, so just some background. So it does seem to be the case that a lot of people do get their news specifically, but also kind of their information relating to all sorts of truths and facts about the world from social media. So a lot of people do. Most of the research, especially recent research that I could find in this regard, related to Americans, but I have some statistics included relating to South Africans. I don't think the kind of exact numbers are that important, but just to see that the scope of the problem becomes apparent when we look at these numbers. So we can see that, for example, that at least 53% of Americans recently in 2021 said that they get their news from social media. It's not clear what is meant by news in terms of the survey, but let's say the kind of information that you would traditionally have gotten from newspapers would probably all of it fall under this understanding. And 36% of those identified Facebook specifically. So we're going to be focusing a lot on Facebook, as will become apparent, over the reasons why will become apparent. So a lot of people get their news from Facebook, but Facebook is by far not the only source of problematic information. And basically the problems that I'm going to identify with Facebook apply to all the big social media sites. In South Africa, the statistic looks more or less similar. So 46% of adults who were surveyed in 2020 said they got their news from said they used social media. Although adults here was defined as 15-year-olds and older living in cities, so it's not that representative of all South African adults, but still it's a large proportion of the population. And for 56% of those, so the majority of those who do use social media said they use it to stay up to date with news and current events. So again, the definition of news and current events used there isn't all that clear, but people get factual information, or what they take to be factual information, from social media. Right. And it also seems to be the case. There's definitely an argument to be made that social media news consumption does not necessarily lead to an accurate view of what is going on in the world. In fact, far from it. So a statistic that has been bandied about quite a lot is that in the 3 months before the 2016 US elections, the top 20 fake news stories, so stories that were obviously fake, on Facebook got more shares than the top 20 real news stories. So stories that were demonstrably from fake news sites got shared more than those that were from reputable news sites, which means, of course, that they reached more people. Whether or not that led to more people believing them is an open question, but we can assume that at least a lot of people got fake news stories and probably believed them, or at least some of what was claimed. And then in research aimed at news consumers via social media specifically, shows that a lot of them could not answer 6 questions. Oh, sorry, this was aimed at Americans in general, not specifically at social media users, but 23% of Americans could not correctly answer 6 questions on whether the sources of their news that they got, so this is any of the news that they got on the internet, whether those sources generated their own news, so whether they were news reporting organizations, the traditional newspapers or media houses, or whether they were simply sites that were reposting other organizations' content. And then social media news consumers specifically were least likely from media consumers who were surveyed to answer questions correctly regarding US politics and the coronavirus. Again, the context here is America. They were more likely to say that news sources exaggerated the threat of the coronavirus, so they were more likely to be suspicious and skeptical of news reports that they did read on the coronavirus, and they thought that news sources, and they didn't discriminate between fake news sources and reputable news sources. they were thought that these sources were more likely to exaggerate the threat of the virus. And similarly, in terms of politics, they were less likely to think that the American public would accept the outcome of the 2020 US election. Okay, so that's all relating to social media specifically. I actually haven't given a definition of social media, but usually those are content sharing sites where the users of the sites also make the content available. They upload the content to the site, share content, and basically have a lot of say about what is made available via the site. Another large player on the internet in terms of our access to information is, of course, Google. And Google does not traditionally qualify as a social media site per se, although it does control social media sites such as YouTube, which is a very big player in terms of where people get news information. But it is a search, of course, the dominant search engine in the world. And the latest statistics that I saw was that it controls 92% of the search engine market share worldwide. So most people, if they do not gain information on the internet via social media, would gain it via Google. And we'll see the relevance of that as my talk continues as well. Okay, so I'm just going to make some kind of basic assumptions, philosophical assumptions, and I just want to say something about the subject or the discipline of virtue epistemology, which is basically going to be the philosophical lens at which I'm going to look at the problem of fake news or false information on the internet and social media use, and then, as we'll see, also search engine use. So firstly, I'm just going to assume that facts do exist and that they are in principle accessible. So I am going to assume that there are truths in the world and that human beings, at least in principle, can have access to those truths if we follow the correct methods, and that we can distinguish, at least in principle, about truth and falsehood. So this isn't going to be a talk that tries to discriminate or give guidelines as to how we can distinguish between what is true and what is false. We're going to assume, firstly, that it is possible to discriminate between the two, that there is such a thing as fake news. So you do have news that is more accurate and more true than others, and that there are more reputable sources of news and less reputable sources of news, but I'm not going to go into what makes an organization reputable. I'm also going to assume that the object of inquiry for most people most of the time is basically truth. So I'm going to assume that most people, at least most of the time, try to determine what actually is the case in the world. And that is often why they perform searches on search engines, and that is often why they consult the news, whether they get their news via social media or other means. Usually people want to figure out what the state of affairs of the world is, and their object is to maximize truth, so to get as close as possible to the truth of the matter, and to minimize falsity. So I'm assuming that most people search for news most of the time in good faith. They do want to know what's going on with the world. They don't want to be deceived. Or sometimes, perhaps people may prefer deception, but I'm treating that as the exception rather than the rule. All right. And then I just want to say a little bit about virtue epistemology. So this is an approach in philosophy to knowledge. Epistemology is the subject of studying knowledge. So firstly, determining what it is, and secondly, determining how we should go about obtaining it. And virtue epistemology is a sub-discipline within the discipline of epistemology. And it looks at, or partly it looks at, which kinds of virtues or which kinds of character traits should we cultivate in order to obtain knowledge. So how should we act in order to obtain knowledge that is more truthful? So how should we go about determining what is true, and how should we minimize being deceived with regard to what is true. So one of the objects of virtue epistemology is to identify what it would call intellectual virtues or intellectual obligations. So what kinds of things does an agent need to do? Which kinds of character traits does an agent need to cultivate in order to at least maximize the possibility that they obtain true knowledge about the world? All right. So traditionally, in terms of virtue epistemology, the focus was very much on the individual obtaining knowledge. The focus was very much on what individuals should do in order to obtain knowledge and in order to ensure that that knowledge is accurate. The focus was perhaps on what individuals should do in order to minimize the spread of misinformation, so in order to minimize kind of erroneously spreading information that isn't true. But there hasn't traditionally been a large focus on the context in which this information is obtained. And this has become more and more relevant in our current situation where the majority of our information comes from the internet. And as we'll see, there are a very few players in the internet who control the information that we have access to, and also whose main aim or main goal is not necessarily epistemic virtue or epistemic good. So they're not mainly concerned with the truth, as we'll see. They are mainly concerned with other considerations that often incentivize disinformation rather than accurate information. All right, so traditionally the kinds of virtues that a virtue epistemology might prescribe that you should cultivate in order to be a good agent, epistemic agent, would be something like a love for truth, a desire for truth, fulfilling all kinds of epistemic responsibilities, like fact-checking, for example. So making sure that you make use of good sources of information, fact-checking before you pass that information on, being skeptical to a reasonable degree about information that you get. So making sure that you don't just accept any information that you obtain at face value, but that you are skeptical and you critique it and interrogate it. This would fall under something like intellectual conscientiousness, being courageous, so being willing to be exposed to opposing viewpoints or information that might disprove ideas that you cherish, and so on. So these kinds of intellectual virtues were often seen as enough to ensure that an epistemic agent, someone who obtains knowledge and who passes it on, at least maximizes the possibility that they are accessing truth and that they are not spreading falsehoods. And your failure to do so your failure to go through a checklist like this and to cultivate these kinds of character traits as an epistemic agent would be considered to render you blameworthy. So the idea there is that if you obtain beliefs and you hold beliefs about the world and you haven't exercised your obligations, you haven't fact-checked, you haven't acted in accordance with a desire for truth, and so on, then you're at least epistemically blameworthy for your beliefs. So you might not be morally blameworthy, although you may be, but you are epistemically blameworthy. So you have failed in your epistemic and intellectual duties as an epistemic agent. And traditionally, the idea was that if you have these kinds of failures in individuals, so you have individuals who believe falsehoods, then the way to improve that is through education. So is to educate them in terms of their intellectual or epistemic obligations, and to educate them in terms of how to meet these obligations. So how to fact check, how to identify reputable sources of information, how to be skeptical, how to identify whether you are acting in accordance with a desire for truth or whether you are acting in accordance with a cognitive bias, for example. But the problem with this in our current information environment, as Miller puts it, is that the information environment itself is not necessarily geared towards truth. So Miller goes too far as to make an argument, and this was in 2019, that social media users who believe outlandish falsehoods, and under this he would include bizarre conspiracy theories such as Pizzagate relating to Hillary Clinton, for example, and all sorts of strange theories. He argues that social media users do not deserve epistemic blame. So they cannot be seen to have failed in their epistemic duties or their intellectual duties or obligations in obtaining these beliefs. And I'll go through his argument briefly to show why he says this, and I largely agree with him. But I actually think that the problem is much wider and goes far beyond that of social media users. So I think we're actually in more trouble than Miller lets on in his discussion of people obtaining knowledge about the world via social media. All right. So with Miller, when he talks about social media, he also includes Google, but mostly with regard to its social media concerns, such as YouTube and so on. He doesn't, to any great extent, discuss the role of Google as a search engine in our knowledge environment or information environment. And that's where I think he underestimates the problem. All right, so what does Miller argue? He basically argues that social media users who develop outlandish beliefs, so beliefs that we can arguably say are false, such as the whole Pizzagate saga surrounding Hillary Clinton and other Democrats, that they run a satanic pedophilic ring out of a basement of a pizza parlor. Even the beliefs that are demonstrably false and bizarre are beliefs that we cannot blame social media users for holding. And his reasons for this are that they are basically ordinary individuals acquiring information in ordinary ways, given our current information environment. So basically, his argument is that even people obtaining quite bizarre and outlandish beliefs have not violated, or have arguably not violated their epistemic obligations, or if they have violated their epistemic obligations, they have a valid excuse for that, given the information environment in which they find themselves. All right. So part of his argument is that epistemic blameworthiness, so your blameworthiness for the beliefs that you hold, comes in a continuum. There are degrees of blameworthiness. And basically his argument is that most people obtaining their beliefs via social media are only partially to blame. So we can say they are partially blameworthy. Sometimes more so. So sometimes they can be more fully blameworthy, but most of the time they are not. And the reasons for this are basically twofold. So mostly when we talk about blameworthiness, both in a moral sphere and an epistemic sphere, people are considered to be less blameworthy if they act or are influenced under compulsion, or if ignorance plays a role in their actions, or in the epistemic case, in what they believe. So basically, if people are compelled or forced to do something in a moral context, we don't hold them morally responsible. Similarly, if people are forced to believe something or compelled to believe something in an epistemic context, we don't hold them blameworthy. And we'll talk about what compulsion or force is or entails in the social media environment. Similarly, if people act out of ignorance, so usually if people do something unknowingly in a moral situation, we don't hold them morally responsible. The same thing in an epistemic environment. If people hold a belief unknowingly, or they don't fulfill their obligation to fact check a belief unknowingly, they don't know that they need to fact check a belief, then we don't hold them epistemically responsible for that belief that they hold. So the main epistemic obligations that Miller focuses on, and that I think are probably the most relevant in this context, are those of fact-checking and avoiding problematic sources of information. Right. So arguably these are kind of two basic obligations that we would expect any person who has a belief and who claims to have knowledge to have followed in their development or their obtaining of that knowledge. So firstly, somehow they must have fact-checked that knowledge. So somehow they must have made an effort to make sure that that knowledge is accurate. If they have good reason to believe that their knowledge isn't, that knowledge isn't accurate. All right. So if you obtain your knowledge from a reputable source, so for example, your doctor tells you that you have a certain disease, we may not expect you to fact check that because the doctor is an expert. So you have no reason to assume that you need to fact check that. However, if you obtain your knowledge from a source that is less authoritative, your I don't know, your herbalist or your barber tells you that you have a disease, then you probably have an obligation to fact check, right? You have reason there to believe that that person is not authoritative in the information that they impart to you. And we would also expect people to avoid problematic sources of information. So if you know that someone is prone to lying, or you know that a certain source of information has a reputation for falsehoods, a tabloid, for example, you could reasonably be expected to avoid that as a source of information. You can reasonably be expected to know that that is not somewhere that you should go to if you want to obtain true knowledge about the world. All right. And you are blameworthy to the extent that most people in your circumstances would have known that they would have had to fact check a source of information, or they would have known that they should avoid a source of information. And so Miller argues that on both counts in our current information environment, people cannot be blamed if they fail to fact check or if they fail to avoid sources of information. So firstly, we can start with the assumption or the obligation of avoiding problematic sources of information. So firstly, Miller claims that most people, well, at least until very recently, may not have realized how problematic social media platforms are as problematic sources of information. So at least until very recently, people may have had an excuse to a lesser or greater extent to believe that the information that they get via their social media feeds is accurate. I actually think that that Miller does not give enough leeway in this regard. That people may not have that people may have less reason to believe that fact checking is necessary than they realize because of the nature of the because of their ignorance of the nature of our information environment. And this ignorance is one that they cannot be held responsible for, as we'll see. So Miller says, on the one hand, that up until recently, people may not have been reasonably been expected to fact check information that they get via their social media feeds. And they can only be held blameworthy to the extent that it is now common knowledge that the information that you get via social media is often tainted. But what people don't have much information on, and this is not due to any fault of their own, is the personalization algorithms on these platforms and how they work. So if we explore that, we're going to see that people have even more reason to fact check, but that people rightly and through no fault of their own do not know that they do need to fact check. All right, and then in terms of avoiding problematic sources of information, well, as Miller points out, this is becoming more and more difficult. It's becoming more and more difficult to opt out of social media. It is becoming more and more difficult to not obtain information via social media because so much of our lives requires us to go onto some form of social media, whether it is onto various social media platforms to gain access to businesses, or whether it is to connect with family and friends. The reach of social media is just so insidious that it's almost impossible to avoid. All right, so his argument, I'm not going to go into it into too much detail, but is that it's unreasonable to expect people to do any great amount of fact checking, given how arduous it is, given how much time and effort is required, and given the extent to which people may not have realized, at least until recently, how much this fact checking is necessary. And then, in as far as it is difficult to avoid social media, people can be excused along the axis of coercion. So to an extent, people, on his view at least, people have been to an extent coerced into finding their information on social media, if only for the reasons that it is the easiest and cheapest way to access information, and to obtain, or at least to keep contact with family and friends. And our resource of information is often kind of mixed up with other incentives to keep us on social media, such as keeping us in touch with our loved ones. But so his claim is that given the information environment, at least up until very recently, given our knowledge of how social media works and the difficulty of avoiding it, people are at least only partially to blame for the outlandish beliefs that they obtain via social media. But he does seem to make a few assumptions that are not warranted if we look into the whole ecology of the internet and how we obtain knowledge or how we obtain information on the internet. So my argument is that Miller severely underestimates the problem, and that people are actually just about wholly not to blame if we take these two axes or these two dimensions of obligation as our measurement for whether or not people are to blame for their beliefs. And that is because of the almost impossibility of accessing information on the internet that is not almost impossibility, it is impossible to access information on the internet that is firstly not curated by an algorithm, and secondly, that is not curated by an algorithm that is not aimed primarily at establishing truth, or is not aimed primarily at giving you information that is accurate. So Miller seems to assume that at least in principle, people can obtain news elsewhere outside of social media, if not outside of the internet. And secondly, he seems to assume that fact-checking is possible on the internet, right? So you can Google the news and obtain true information. It's just arduous, right? So it just takes a lot of time and effort, and that time and effort is more than we can expect from people. And he also seems to assume that people's ignorance on the prevalence of misinformation on social media has been acceptable. It has been an excuse, but that it has becoming less of an excuse as the problems surrounding social media use and misinformation on social media have become more and more obvious. But there's an additional aspect to our ignorance in terms of what is served up to us on the internet that Miller doesn't give attention to, and that I think makes the ignorance excuse in terms of that we don't even know that we need to fact check, that we don't even know that our sources of information are problematic, that makes that still a very strong excuse. Problematic because we are in the dark to a greater extent than we realize, but at least epistemically that means that we are less to blame than Miller implicates. All right, so I'm just going to say a little bit about the information environment, the internet, and how we are served up information on the internet as a whole. So this goes beyond social media use. The social media is a very prevalent and important aspect of information and our portal to information on the internet, but it's by no means the only one. And my point of discussing how we obtain knowledge via the internet, or how we obtain information via the internet, is to make clear that misinformation is not only a problem of social media users, it is everyone's problem who uses the internet. And everyone on the internet faces the same problem that social media users face in terms of the difficulty of obtaining true information, or the difficulty of fact-checking. And that my final point is going to be that the blame for the situation should be put almost wholly on a few internet platforms, and that even with the best intentions in the world, most epistemic agents, ordinary epistemic agents, us, cannot even hope to fulfill our epistemic obligations. And some of us are better equipped to do that than others. So those of us who are able and know that we cannot trust what we access by, or what we are served up via social media, and we are a little bit internet savvy and we have access to other sources of information, we might be better placed than others to avoid, or at least fact check, misinformation and disinformation, but that we're all more or less in the same boat, and that is problematic. So, as various researchers have pointed out, search engines are basically surrogate experts. They're basically the experts of the 21st century. So it is almost impossible for us to use information, or to access information, if we don't use search engines somewhere along the line. And of course, the primary one is Google. As I pointed out earlier, at least 92% of web traffic goes through, or searches go through Google. Search engines such as Google purport to be epistemic tools. So at least Google search presents itself as a tool to help you access information. That is how it presents itself. That is supposedly, purportedly, its main function. And most of us are forced to use it. We can't avoid search engines. They are just there's just too much information on the web, and we don't have the resources by any stretch of the imagination to access even a minuscule part of this outside of search engine use. So we're coerced into using search engines for all intents and purposes. The problem is that search engines, even though they present themselves as primarily being epistemic tools, primarily being tools to help us find information, that's not actually how they function. Their main aim, or at least one of their other main aims, they have at least two functions. Some of the time, the aim of search engines is to point us to information, and sometimes it is to point us to accurate information. But there's a very strong driving factor of in terms of how search engines work, and that is that they are aimed at maximizing clicks and maximizing time spent on sites. And this is also an underlying dynamic on social media platforms. So, and my argument is going to be is that they're mainly designed, search engines are mainly designed in order to maximize clicks and maximize the time that you spend on sites, or at least spend using search engines. And the same thing applies to social media platforms. And that this shifts the epistemic blame for the erroneous beliefs that people develop onto these platforms, that this makes them epistemically more responsible for the false beliefs that we are currently surrounded with than individuals who are failing in their epistemic duties. All right. sorry, I'm going to skip that slide because it's just some technical information on how we should evaluate search engines as epistemic tools. All right, so why do I say that search engines, and usually when I say search engines, I mean Google, that they are not primarily, or not, at least not always, geared towards helping us find information? One of the people might not always realize this, but the main driving force behind the internet currently is advertising, and it is personalized advertising or targeted advertising. So the main business of Google and Facebook and basically most social media sites and search engines, although not all search engines, is to advertise. They're basically large advertising platforms. And the main way in which they make money is to target personalized ads at us. So Google and Facebook and YouTube and all of those sites are in the business of linking advertisers with customers. And their main claim to fame is that they are able to personalize adverts. So they don't only connect advertisers and an audience, they connect advertisers with specific audience members. They precisely target the users in terms of the likelihood that they are going to click on the ad. So I'm not going to go through the details on how this works, but basically huge troves of our personal data is harvested as we browse the internet, mainly by outfits such as Google and Facebook. And the whole purpose of this is to make sure that they are able to precisely target advertisements at you, whether it is at you and they have information such as your name and your address and your cell phone number, or whether it is at your IP address. So they might not link that information to you personally in terms of identifiable information such as an address and a name and a telephone number, but they link it to your IP address and to you as a browser on the web. And this is very profitable. So it's the history of Google. Basically, it started off as a search engine aimed at obtaining the most accurate and authoritative results given a search term. But it became clear very quickly that this isn't profitable at all. You don't make money this way. So it's interesting to go read Brin and Page. They are the creators of Google, to go read their original academic article, where they actually state that they don't believe in advertising on Google and social search engines in general, because this skews the result, or at least it runs the risk of skewing the results. And then going from that to the relatively recent statistic of 88.7% of Google's profit coming from advertising. And so basically, what this means is when Google delivers search results, the main considerations that go into the search results that it is going to deliver to you are not simply whether the source of the information that it delivers to you is authoritative, whether the information that it delivers to you is accurate, but also whether it is the kind of information that you would like to see. And so they target you specifically, and whether the advertisements that they can place along with that information would appeal to you. So those are additional incentives that go into, or possible additional incentives that go into which search results you are shown. The problem with Google is that their search engine, the way or their algorithm, is very opaque. So we don't actually know what the exact parameters are, or the signals are that go into determining what you get when you search a term on Google. We know that they say that they have 200 quality signals. in addition to the rank that their pages already have. And so there's a whole algorithm that determines how relevant a page is to a search engine, or I mean to a search term. Plus then 200 additional quality signals, which probably relate to the personal data that they have on you and advertising considerations, but we don't know because these are a trade secret. They determine what you see on your search page, or at least they determine the rankings. So these quality signals and the page rank of the pages relating to a certain search term determine what appears on the first page of your search, what appears higher up, and what appears lower down, and so on. All right, so one problem that we can already see with regard to Google is that it is not clear and transparent what determines what you get, what information you get when you Google it. And everyone does not get the same information when they enter a Google search term. So who you are as a browser and your browser history and the information that they have relating to you determines, or at least partly determines, what you see. And this is determined by algorithms. So this is done automatically by AI. There are human content checkers and human fact checkers who, after the fact, sometimes relating to some content, do quality control, but this is after the fact, and it's the amount of pages that they can do quality checks on are, of course, minuscule in relation to what there is out there. So that's a problem with Google. In terms of Facebook, as I've said, on social media sites, and Facebook is, of course, the dominant one, the predominant one. Their main aim is to maximize the time that you spend on it and to maximize engagement. And what they mean with engagement is basically clicks. So if you like something or post any emoticon on Facebook, if you click on something in Facebook, if you comment on something, that's an engagement. And they want that because that is information that they can harvest. That gives them information on the kind of person you are and the kind of things that you like and dislike. And that allows them to tailor adverts to you. Again, algorithms tailor the advertisements. Algorithms determine what you see in terms of advertisements and also in terms of content. So what comes up on your news feed is determined, again, by complex considerations that go into various algorithms, the main aim of which is to keep you on the site. The main aim of which is to keep you engaged for as long as possible. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to say a little more about the information environment and then something about the implications. So this is not the worst of it yet. There's a further aspect to this digital advertising ecosystem, and that is that Google places ads on various websites. So Google doesn't only present you with ads on the search pages. So when you go into Google and you Google a search term and you get a page that ranks pages that you can go to, that's not the only place where you see Google advertisements. They also place ads on websites. So people have basically give Google advertising space on their websites, whatever website that is, a news website, a blog, a health website. Google links advertisers to that space, and algorithms decide which ads are shown to which people. So again, everyone who goes to a news website won't necessarily see the same advertisements on that site. The advertisements are precisely targeted. And this has led to an ecology on the internet that is ripe for misuse. So a classic example is that came from Villiers in Macedonia with the 2016 US elections. So for some reason, the residents, or some of the residents of Villiers in Macedonia, figured out how to game the system. And so for a while before the 2016 elections in America, a huge amount of fake news sites were created in Villiers, and basically all sorts of bizarre fake claims were made regarding Trump and his campaign, mostly in favor of Trump. And these gained huge traction and were shared widely on Facebook and made teenagers in North Macedonia who were creating these fake news pages an enormous amount of money, partly via AdSense. So basically ads were posted on their fake websites via Google's AdSense by companies who were being linked to the audiences of these fake news articles relating to Trump, and of course relating to Democrats and pushing all sorts of misinformation about them. So the problem is, as Gosh and Scott point out, is that we have an ecosystem on the internet where accuracy, informational accuracy, takes second place to advertising dollars. And the advertising dollars are currently flowing through two main sites, and those are Google and Facebook. And Google and Facebook have a tremendous reach across the internet in terms of placing advertisers across the internet, in terms of linking consumers or users to advertisers. And these advertising considerations often determine what we see. It often determines the content that we are served up. So we are not only served with the adverts themselves, but we are served with the kind of content that we are likely to find appealing, which is going to increase the likelihood that we are going to visit sites or stay on sites and be exposed to advertising. And malicious actors, which is often code for Russian actors, have also found ways to exploit this. So there are all sorts of ways in which to exploit this ecosystem where misinformation is being pumped out at a large scale. And it's difficult for platforms such as Google and Facebook to mitigate the problem, even if they were incentivized to do so. So in some instances, they seem less interested in addressing the problem than in others. Recently, we've seen with anti-vaccine information, they do claim that they are addressing the problem, or at least taking down sites that push misinformation. But the resources that they are throwing at this are minuscule in comparison with the scope of the problem. And so the kind of epistemic conclusion that I want to draw on the basis of all of this is that we are actually, as individuals, we carry very little blame in terms of the disinformation and misinformation that we believe, just because of the massive scope of it and the impossibility for us as individuals to avoid it. We cannot avoid using the internet. We cannot avoid often accessing the information that we get about the world via the internet, and we have no insight into how the algorithms work. We have no insight into why we are presented with specific bits of content rather than others. And until there is more transparency in this regard, I don't think we can lay the blame, at least not full blame, at the feet of people who obtain outlandish beliefs, strange beliefs via the internet. I do think there is a lot more that needs to be done in terms of stipulating the obligations that internet platforms have relating to their epistemic duties in making sure that it is at least possible to access accurate and true information. Whether or not this is possible in the current advertising environment is another question.